All right, fantastic. This is such a weird interface. What are you doing, Teams? So I can see this, but I can't see you folks anymore, which is fine. Well, I mean, I would like to see you, but I'll work with Teams. Okay. So as promised, my introduction, who I am. So my name's Faye Seidler. I'm a lifelong North Dakotan. I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community in a lot of different ways, and I myself am a suicide survivor. I bring that up because a lot of my work is suicide prevention in particular, and I'm a suicide prevention advocate first and foremost. So while I work a lot with the LGBTQ plus community in terms of like data and outcomes, I work anywhere that suicidality is going to be a heightened risk factor. So if we're looking at queer populations or indigenous populations or first responders or anything like that, I consider all that my work. So a lot of the times when I talk about or think about things within our queer community, I often think about them from that lens of suicide reduction or increased opportunity is how I often talk about that. So I have a lot of backgrounds I have in the state. So I've been doing this work for about 10 years now. And if you know suicide prevention, you know the 988 number. In the bottom right there, you can actually see me in front of the 988 bus next to the director of First Link who answers that call line. I work with FirstLink very closely. They answer our 988 regionally. But that's the importance for the work for me is that suicide prevention piece. I work as an LG plus care coordinator for Canopy Medical Clinic. So I have a medical background for a lot of the work that we do, not as like a doctor, but more as like an administrator, data, grant writer, and pretty much everything else that happens in a clinic that's not seeing a patient. When you work at a small clinic, you kind of end up doing a little bit of everything. Then I also do program management for Harbor Health Initiative, which is a nonprofit looking to basically increase opportunities for our queer populations. So I have a list of every affirming provider across the state. And a lot of my work is statewide. I'm located in Fargo-Moorhead, but I try to keep my eyes and ears open for everything. I also collect all the data that we have for queer populations in North Dakota. And I also submit questions for our youth risk behavior survey. And a lot of the data that I can go over tends to be from there. But I don't think we're going to get into too much of that today. Just understand that a lot of our queer populations don't have great outcomes. I should ask too, are we recording? Do you need to record yet?
Yes, we're recording.
Okay, fantastic. I'm used to the Zoom thing where it's just like recording is now in progress. Uh, but yeah, I've been doing this for quite a long time, so that's a bit of my background. This training here is actually like a 2-hour module, so I'm actually just going to be looking at a couple of slides in it that I think are really important, given we have some limited time, as well as Lex providing a lot of really good on-hands experience, which is a lot more valuable than some of the stuff that I have here. But what I typically do in my trainings is I look at our identity and how we form these ideas we have about queer people, awareness of those negative outcomes, and then ways to improve process. I will say after this training is over, if you ever need to reach out to me about anything, I'm very accessible. I want to be, so I can help people that are doing work. So what I really want to focus on in the time that we have together is actually going to be something around queer narratives. Because I think for a lot of folks, we're dealing with this at a professional level, not for a very long time. Like for a lot of people, maybe 5 years or 10 years, but not much more than that for a lot of people that have gotten into this work from a social work lens or any kind of human service lens. We haven't really kind of had to deal with our trans population, and except for pretty recently. And when we think about this population, we think about queer populations and what they might need from us. It's we have a lot of feelings that kind of go into those conversations that we don't necessarily think about. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here, and this isn't interactive. This is for you to kind of think about to yourself. And the first question, this is kind of a personal reflection of your experiences. I want you to think about how old you were when you first heard or understood what it meant to be gay, bisexual, transgender, any one of these labels that we have in the wider queer community. I just want you to think about pretty quickly, how old were you when you first heard these things? Um, it could be at different ages for gay or bi. And I can tell you for myself, I first heard the word lesbian when I was 9 and I had no idea what it meant. Like my parents were talking about it and they talked about their friend becoming a lesbian and having to leave their family. And the way I first heard it, I thought it was like a disease someone got. I thought like someone was infected with lesbianism and they had to leave so they wouldn't infect other people. Like that's how I understood it as a kid because that's how my parents talked about it. So how old were you when you first heard these words? Were you 9? Were you 15? Were you 30? I think for some folks who are older, they maybe 50 or 60 when they hear the word transgender for the first time. So just kind of think about when you first heard it. I also want you to think about how old were you when you first kind of explored your gender identity or sexual orientation. So if you were gay or bi or queer, if you were trans, how old were you when you first thought, do these labels apply to me? And maybe you haven't, or maybe you have, maybe it was younger, maybe it was older, but was there a time you thought about if these labels that we think about apply to yourself? And this is a pretty casual exercise. Just think about it for a couple seconds. So I want you to bring those two thoughts together, and I want you to think about what was culture like or the opinion about queer people during those moments in your life. And when you think about that, also think what it might be like for other people and other people's cultures. And culture could be, broad culture, it could be generational culture, um, it could be a new American culture. Like, what was the opinion about queer people like for you when you first heard about these things, when you first thought it applied to yourself? Because I think for a lot of folks who are over 20, when we first heard about or thought about these things, well, there's often a lot of negative connotation to it. Like if I were to struggle with thinking about if I was a lesbian or not at 9, I would be thinking, do I have a disease? Have I been infected by something? And a lot of people, when they think about these ideas, they kind of believe that they have this blank slate to it, that they can just unbiasedly, rationally, and logically think, what is it to be gay? What is it to be trans? And I think a lot of us fail to realize that we've had messages about this our entire life, explicitly and implicitly. So, what has informed our perceptions to get us to where we are today? And when we look at it historically, there's a lot of history that's happened, but I'm going to break it into 3 points. The first one is the Hayes Code in 1934 that disallowed any positive representation of LGBTQ plus people, and that was on the books for about 30 years until 1960. I think it was 1968 actually, a little over 30 years. But in that generation of people, you only saw negative stories about what it meant to be gay. You only got negative messages about what it meant to be gay or different in any way. And often the stories that we got to see about, let's say, trans or gay people at that time demonized it or ended in tragedy or just treated these characters as in some way pathetic. That's how, if you didn't grow up in that, your parents did, and if they didn't, their grandparents did. And if they grew up in that culture, those are the mores and social values that they instilled on their kids. But that's not the only thing that happened. In the 1980s, we had the AIDS pandemic do two really terrible things for us as a culture and a society. The first one is that a lot of gay men of color and trans women died because of our lack of intervention with AIDS when it was starting to happen. And there was a lot of stigma and prejudice at that time that played out without us having good adequate response to it. So not only did we lose hundreds of thousands of gay men and trans women, um, they aren't here to be elders anymore. They could have been having conversations in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. They could have been role models. They could have been there on boards to talk about these things and to make us understand each other a little bit better, but they're not. They died. And not only that, at the time, there was such a moral panic about what it meant to be gay or trans or different because parents thought if you identified this way, you were dead. That's how they thought about these things. And if that wasn't how you were raised, it was how your parents were raised. This was only 40 years ago that we really were dealing with all the ramifications of this. And to today, still feel those same ramifications, the same terror about what it can be to be queer that makes us a little bit scared or apprehensive to even think about these identities. And even going up to Matthew Shepard being killed and sparking national attention for queer rights, that was in 1998. That was 26 years ago. That was barely a generation ago. It's still our current history. It's still living history that we experienced that. And there's a lot more that happened, but I think Matthew Shepard's a big turning point for people because at that point we were thinking, we might have apprehensions about a person being gay or trans or different, but we don't want them to die. We don't want this level of hate and vitriol. And I think that's when we really started having a turning point. And after 1998, we saw things like Trevor Project really rise up. And we saw this effort where we kind of started to see parents see these kids as their own and go, we want to keep them safe. We don't want them to experience this hardship or discrimination. And There are a lot more figures, there's a lot more history than these 3 points, but just to show you that generationally, we've had a lot of these negative messaging the whole time. When we look at trans people, it's been pretty recent for a lot of us. We don't have a lot of literature and history that most of us engage with. GLAAD Media did a 10-year study of media representation in transgender people and found that only 12% of the storylines between 2002 and 2012 were considered groundbreaking, fair, or accurate. That means that 88% of the stories on media just 20 years ago were not groundbreaking, were not fair, and were not accurate. There's a really good documentary called Disclosure on Netflix that Janet Mock put out, and it shows there's a trans character in Sex and the City in the early 2000s, and she was introduced, and they actually altered her voice to sound more masculine than she naturally sounded because she wasn't believably trans. She passed too well as quote unquote a woman, so they had to purposely misrepresent her to make a story point. That's how trans individuals have been portrayed in this very sensational way. And when you only get your information on what it means to be trans from media, from politics, from these sensational sources that aren't groundbreaking, that aren't fair and aren't accurate, you're not really understanding what it is to be trans. You're getting an idea of it, I'm trying to say a word I can't pronounce in person, a sacralinium, I think is what it's called. It's a philosophical concept. I shot for it and I tried, and now it's recorded forever. But here what we have is that a lot of people got their information about what it meant to be trans from media. That means they didn't personally know a trans person. In 2008, 92% of their people were getting their information just from media. That's all they're getting the information from. Even to today, 2021, when they last looked at it, 58% of people are getting their information about trans people from the media. And sometimes the only information they're getting is that trans people are scary and predators and hurting kids. Like, this is the messages that some people only hear about. This really kind of moral panic and scare and terror, kind of like I heard in the 1980s or 1990s, I guess, when my parents were talking about being lesbian. A lot of the same prejudice we saw and same fear we saw in the 1980s with AIDS, we're seeing with trans kids today. This fear that we have to protect kids from being trans in the same way we had to protect kids from being gay. When we look at generations right now, we see that if you look at traditionalist, about 0.8% identified in the queer community up to Generation Z, which is about 20% today. This is 2021. There's a Gallup poll that was just done a little bit ago. It's putting Generation Z at 22% now, and it's showing that Generation Z women in particular, about 30% are identifying as bisexual. And I think all these numbers have gone up slightly. But when we look at this number, a lot of people look at it and they go, what has caused so many people to be gay? That is the common discourse I hear about it. What is causing so many people to be gay? Is it influencers? Is it YouTube? Is it something else going on that's causing this? And what people don't look at is what has been causing people to not want to be open. And we have so much history about that. We have the Hays Code impacting this generation. We have HIV and AIDS pandemic impacting this generation, including violence and arresting people that were, the laws on homosexuality is what was called in this era, and going up to the first generation post Matthew Shepard that really had a society which they could be themselves. I will say that there's not a right number, and I think that's where people get the mistakes. They think that a certain percentage of people should be gay or trans or something like that, but there's not a right number. This number could be 5% lower, it could be 5% higher. It doesn't matter. What matters is, are our kids safe? Are they safe to talk about who they are? Are they safe to talk about it without risk of being kicked out or beaten or any of these awful things? Are our kids safe? Because if they are, it doesn't matter what this number is. If they can be who they are and have a good quality of life and access to care and love, I don't care what that number is. It doesn't matter. But we do have a reason to explain why so many more people today might identify as queer, because we have the first generation that grew up with the chance to actually be themselves. I didn't have that growing up. I'm not very old, but there was one openly gay high school kid in my high school in the early 2000s. That was it. There's a reason there's so many more kids that can identify this way now. The other way we can look at that is left-handedness, and we saw that left-handedness increased from 2% to 12% over the course of 50, 100 years. And the reason for that we apply to how we forced every kid to be left-handed. We said that that was a proper and natural way for people to be. And when we stop forcing everyone to be that way, more people are just naturally left-handed, and that's what we found. It's not because in 1940 there was left-handed YouTube stars that were influencing kids into it. It was just when people can be who they are, when you give them avenues to grow into whatever makes sense for them, they are going to have diverse expressions if we don't force one particular narrative on them. So that's a lot of where our cultural perception and history has kind of shaped the ways that we see this and why so many more youth are kind of embodying this. The last thing I'll say before I kick it off over to Lex to talk more about the kind of on-hands experience and more about some of the labels and terminology is just when you actually interact with these kids, like from my perspective, like going to a pride parade or going to Pride in the Park, there's all that national conversation that's always really scary about rights and about contagion and all these different things. But when you see kids interact with like these labels and identities, they see just all the ways humans can be and how cool that is. Like, it's such a cool thing for them to see that they can grow up and have all these options available to them for what their life can look like. And that's fantastic. It's really cool that we have those opportunities for kids, and that's what I tend to see. So this is a small part of this training, and if you ever want more access to it, you can always email me. I have a lot more on data and like specific one-on-one process improvements for like social workers or doctors because I work a lot within those fields. But that's just what I have. So I'm going to let Lex go from here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to my stuff, and hopefully it all worked out. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm back. I couldn't see you. So if I was kicked off 20 minutes ago and didn't know, that would have been embarrassing.
Oh no, you did awesome, Faye. I could hear you loud and clear. That was great. Let me see if I can share my screen. This is actually the first time I'm doing that on here. So where do I go? Let's see. I usually do Zoom myself. So let me, is it the
I see
share
mine on
tray?
the top right by the leave, actually. So be careful.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. Can y'all see my screen?
Yep, I see it perfectly.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's see if this opens up. Give it a second here. Let it load. I'll give you guys all a little bit more of an introduction on myself as well once I get this all going here. Here we go. All right, so just a little bit more of an introduction. Again, I had mentioned I have been a facilitator with QSpace for 2+ years. I'm actually going to go a little bit ahead and tell y'all a little bit about QSpace before I dive into some of the other stuff about me. But what QSpace is a safe space for the queer community in Bismarck, North Dakota. It was opened up in 2019 by Zayden. And then about 6 months later, our other facilitator, Alyssa, came on, who I know has been the one I think in contact with Nikki the most. And then a little bit about our groups that we have. We usually meet on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, twice a month at least, from 6:30 to 8. Sometimes in the summertime, we do tend to increase that to if the kids are a little bit more available. And the ages usually are approximately from 11 to 18, but that just kind of depends on the child. Usually how we get people signing up for QSpace is through our online media platforms. We have a lot of parents reaching out that just kind of, are looking for a space that's kind of safe for their kids who have expressed that they are a member of the LGBTQ plus community or, are just kind of questioning that part about themselves. We'll get back a little bit more to QSpace in a minute, but a little bit more on myself. When I joined QSpace 2 years ago, I identified the way that I still do now, but when I first started interacting with these kids, they were the ones that actually really instilled in me the confidence to just find out who I was. And I reached out to Zayden my second year of college looking for just a volunteer opportunity to kind of, use my skills working with kids and stuff too, to just find a community I could be of service to. And under the other facts about me, college student, I'm almost graduated. We're almost there. I have one semester left next fall, and I'll be graduating with my bachelor's in social work. And I currently too, I got a job just a couple weeks back at YouthWorks here in Bismarck, North Dakota. And at the end of this presentation, I'll be sure to leave my info. So if anybody needs help, please feel free to reach out in that area as well. I will be working in their shelter, mainly working on working with the kids that are, struggling at home. And it's, I think their program is just called the Runaway Program. That I will be mainly focusing on. And then I will be doing my internship there next fall as well. So a little bit more in depth about kind of some of these terms. I identify as non-binary pansexual. A lot of people, I tell them that and they don't know what that means. And I do prefer to go by the pronouns they/them. And, growing up in Bismarck, North Dakota, I never really knew how to have that conversation, especially with like my family members. And, just out of respect of how they have always known me, I still present myself very femininely as well. So I don't find offense when I get called different pronouns, but just to kind of go a little bit further in depth about some of those terms, just little on the surface stuff. So I know Faye had mentioned a little bit, a little difference between gender and sexual orientation. So both of these things are on what we consider a spectrum. Over here, man, over here, woman, and you can kind of be somewhere in between. And they are also fluid, meaning they can kind of change throughout the times. And as Faye also talked, as things change in society, a lot of individuals feel a lot more comfortable as well, diving into this sense of who they are. So gender identity, that is that sense of what your gender is. And for me, non-binary, I just consider myself someone who doesn't fit on either side. And I also, as you can see, identify as a pansexual as well. And that means that I am attracted to all certain genders, regardless of their gender identity or what have you. And I always kind of think it's funny comparing those two things, because really, if you look at them, what it means is I'm very indecisive and I can't decide what I like and what I don't. But, getting down to the bulk of these terms, the terms themselves, labels don't necessarily matter, but what they do is they kind of allow someone to finally feel validated in, oh, that's how I feel. And we can really help, with the teens too. Just understanding those terms better for me allows, when they teach me, my understanding gets so much easier, if that makes sense. Diving a little bit further into QSpace and what we kind of do at those meetings, majority of what we do is crafts. We like to really focus on prioritizing what the youth want to do. So we are always asking them for their ideas, really focusing on, especially if there's some heavy stuff going on, either in the media or, at school, in the state that we live in, wherever you may be, things getting passed that affect them. We always want to also make sure that we are providing that space for them to talk about those things. Um, we usually, what we do is we pick one kid who is kind of the lead of the group, or the older kid in the group, who will kind of facilitate this talking circle. And we, me, Alyssa, and Zayden, we all just get to show up and just kind of hang out with these kids and watch how they interact. But as I said on the bottom here, most importantly, we're just giving them a space that is non-judgmental. We are giving them examples of queer role models, that they can also rely on for questions. With working at YouthWorks and working at the emergency shelter, within the first couple weeks here that I've been trained in, it came to my attention that I believe 85% of the people that are the kids that transition from youth services into young adult services are members of the LGBTQ plus community coming from all over our state. So, I feel super honored that I get to be involved in these kids' lives before they do get out into the real world, because being a queer person myself, and struggling financially with how crazy the world is, you know it makes me feel a lot better too, that they have somewhere to go, and they have role models too out in the community that are there to help them and do just want the best for them. I wanted to, I believe, next dive into pronouns, being respectful. This is kind of also where I wanted to talk about how the kids taught me. And it's wild how understanding kids from junior high, even elementary school, their siblings and stuff too, and middle school and high school up into young adulthood. I have watched these kids interact, and we only meet twice a month, but sometimes they come into the meet and they decided, they want to try out a different pronoun or a different name, and without a beat, the kids around them in the group just adapt and change. And I still struggle being someone who is my socially constructed ideas from society of what gender are and what they look like. Someone looks feminine to me, and I immediately am just going to call them her or she, But these kids taught me that they don't have that automatic response. They're able to take that into consideration, and it just, it comes naturally. And I put down here on the bottom, if you're unsure of someone who identifies, just ask. It's not necessarily an offensive thing. Anyone that I've ever met from the queer community who has asked what their pronouns were takes it as a compliment, just because you're trying to understand their identity. And a good way to kind of work that into the conversation is just be like, "Hi, I'm so and so, and my pronouns are these." Introducing yourself with your pronouns is just a good way to kind of open that door and to allow people, that understanding of respect. And I mentioned here too, using those correct pronouns fosters that supportive, inclusive environment. And this is a good example that the kids also taught me. If you're struggling to use the correct pronouns when it comes to someone who might be somewhere in between on the spectrum, I just always imagine that that individual is behind a door, not a glass door, as you can see on the side, one of these non-translucent doors that you can't see through. You don't know what they look like on the other side. So our socially constructed ideas of gender and what people look like don't exist. And I asked this question: what are their pronouns? How would you refer to that individual? I have it bolded there, they, them. We already kind of use this type of language in everyday conversation. But kind of just to bring up a topic Faye even mentioned, the media's idea is the media being how it is, always has been. You can have those influences and those ideas that I think are kind of silly, because we get convinced of things that aren't really true. That like we don't use this kind of language, or how can I change something I've always thought of? But really, when you think of it even this way, this is how we've always explained these terms or talked about people when we were unsure of their gender, or we didn't meet them yet. So those are just some good examples. I like to give that because, like I had even said, I really, really struggle myself even to not understand, but to use those terms, just because my brain automatically just kind of goes down its own rabbit hole. And the next little part of my presentation here is, I know Nikki had reached out to Alyssa and had mentioned, just wanting some suggestions on how to better support LGBTQ plus youth that might be coming into services. And I have 5 key points here. And each of these, you can go so deep into what they really mean, but just to kind of touch on a little bit, QSpace itself being invented in 2019. Really what it did was allow a space for kids to come and express how they felt, and also to just have somewhere that they can feel supported. Going back to my point even about young adulthood, kids transitioning into young adulthood, and a lot of those individuals who are struggling being members of the LGBTQ plus community. They're coming from homes where they're getting separated or getting kicked out because of this problem that is something that is turned into a problem by a family member, or whatever situation they might have found themselves in. But number one is just to kind of foster that environment outside of QSpace, because that's super important. Making sure you're listening to the youth, making sure as well that you're educating yourself on these topics that you don't necessarily understand or might be more new aged. I find myself very lucky because I'm a college student right now, and going for social work. I also picked a ton of classes that were very focused on gender, very focused on equality, discrimination, oppression, and having that background education, I am better able to even apply that to the diverse kids that we have come into our services just at QSpace. Second, being a role model for kindness and inclusion. A little point here, I said just being intolerable of all kinds of hate speech and standing up for others. This is another good example of this too. Is standing up for not just the queer individuals around us, but also individuals who are people of color that may be struggling to fit in, or other people bullying them at school. That being able to stand up against that, and making sure that these kids know right from wrong. And also fostering an environment, number three, where our youth are comfortable to be their authentic selves. Again, that's what QSpace has created, and we want to make sure that we're taking that back home so that these kids don't feel like they don't have anywhere else to turn, that they need to run, or find other options. Being your authentic self, really, one way we can help others is by avoiding assumptions. And why I made sure to add that point in there is because a lot of even Faye's presentation demonstrated how today we see an influx of all of these individuals who are identifying as all of these terms, and we're very convinced that the media is turning everyone gay. It's the gay agenda. And, I don't think there is a gay agenda. And if there is, no one told me about it. But um, one thing that we can really do is make sure that our youth aren't having to suppress that self-expression, because besides homelessness, another really large thing that these kids struggle with is suicide, and so that being able to have an environment they're living in that makes sure they're able to be themselves. How we do that is, practice what you preach, teach it, be yourself, be your authentic self. I struggle with that very much, but I'm still learning. And number four, I added take action at the local level, and create and maintain safe spaces. So supporting inclusive policies in school. In North Dakota here, there have been quite a few negative bills in our state passed to kind of deter inclusivity in the school systems. And what we can do is right now, I really struggle with this one with our kids at QSpace, because a lot of them feel it's very unfair. And some of them too had access to these services, and then they were taken away. So with being in a place of more power than these kids have, being the adults that we need to make sure we're listening. We're going back to that active listening to them. What do they want? And having access to these things is important to them. So making sure we're taking their needs into consideration, not just our own, ideas of what we think is, best for them. And then lastly, stay informed and advocate for those who do not have a voice yet, just as I kind of had just mentioned. Uh, and then I have a last little point here too. I have, sorry, Kat. I have a discussion time, questions, concerns, feedback. I don't know if you guys would like me to keep this up for a moment. If you want to take down my information at the bottom, I think there's a chat option as well. I could always probably put that in there. But yeah, I think that's all I have. Thank you guys. How do I get out of here? We'll figure it out. There we go. Yay.
I do have just a couple quick questions. So it sounds like with your meeting times on Wednesdays, that's primarily with the kids alone. Do you ever do any like education or work with the parents aside from those Wednesday meeting times?
We don't besides just that Wednesday, but we do bring in, I had a few other slides I wanted to click into, but I got nervous and I didn't have enough time. But we do bring in a bunch of educators that do come in and present during those Wednesday meetings. We've had a nurses come in and do stuff with the kids. We've had a few individuals to come in during Indigenous Peoples Month as well, coming and teaching stories about Native Americans, about Two Spirit, and even they've taught us how to do some bead medallion work too during Pride. So we do bring in educators, but it's usually just that Wednesday slot, just because our kids are super set on that day. The only other thing we do is on those same weeks that or the opposite weeks that we don't meet with QSpace, we do a zine. I think I'm pronouncing that right. A zine meet on Fridays as well with the kids, where we just open that up where they can come and submit their work and do art and stuff. And then that is turning into our prom committee coming up. So we do meet a little bit more with the kids, and a lot of the parents do reach out to and ask to help with volunteering. They come and they help a lot with the Pride events, the parades, stuff like that. So there's definitely opportunities for educators and kids and parents as well.
Very cool.
I can add there, if I may, there are parent support groups that exist across the state specifically for parents of queer youth. So PFLAG is like the big national one. There's a PFLAG chapter in Grand Forks, and there was one in Bismarck that closed down. But even though they don't have an official chapter, like you can still get in contact with the people who led it if you need that one-on-one peer support between the parents. And there's also Project Ray in Fargo. So if you're looking for like parents to have kind of a safe environment to talk to other parents about their queer youth, those exist for that space particularly.
That's very cool. I had no idea that those existed. And that was kind of my next question, if there was any um, mentor support groups available for parents. And then kind of leading into my next question too. So obviously QSpace is located in Bismarck. Is there any other similar programs located throughout the state?
So I am the person that knows pretty much all out across North Dakota. So my Safe Harbors or sorry, that's a different thing, kind of. I'm gonna put in the chat. Harbor Health Initiative is the thing I work under. It's under Community Uplift Program, but it has a directory that's all the affirming healthcare providers, but it's also all of the affirming organizations that exist across the state, and you can actually like search through them and find them. But I do say that you can just email me because I know all that off the top of my head and I can save you time. And sometimes keep in mind, I think the biggest problem with these organizations is they're typically volunteer led, which means sometimes you could spend a week to get an answer back and you need something today. I am doing this work all of the time, so I can usually, get in touch with you, get you information, and if you find like they're not getting back to you, I can maybe like call them on the phone or something and be like, "Hey, check your inbox." So you can use the directory if you just want to find something yourself. If you don't see something there, you can ask me because sometimes I know there's individuals that want to do those that like will help in that, and they could be professionals or they could be people in the organizations themselves. So basically that's one avenue, but connect with me and I can find support somehow.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Was there any other questions? Anything anyone had written down?
Jackie kind of asked a few of the ones that I had.
And then I don't know if you've stopped the recording, but if you wanted to do that, then we can, you know, feel better about having difficult conversations.